Recently I came across these paintings by TB Choi, and it mesmerized me how easily she was able to shift between different styles. Over the years browsing YouTube, I noticed there's lots of videos online about finding your art style, how to find your art style, and I've watched a fair share of them myself. But after seeing this work by TB Choi, I felt inspired that maybe we didn't need to find just one art style, but we could learn to draw in whatever style we wanted.
So, how exactly are we going to learn that?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I came up with the idea to challenge myself to redraw an established character in as many different styles as I could. And what better character than Sage from Valorant?
Wait, so why is there no better character?
Look, I just want an excuse to say I was immortal.
Episode 4.
Look, you don't need to read that out. Hi, my name is Mohit, but you can also call me Teisus, and I might have peaked immortal in Valorant, but the real goal is to hit rank 1 in art. Anyway, it is pretty important to use a character that we know has a good design, so that we aren't distracted by improving the character and we can really focus on the topic at hand. I believe style can be broken down into 2 different characteristics: how you sketch or draw lines, and how you render. Each of these have their respective attributes. I'll try my best to break them down as we learn together. Before I get into specific studies of different artists, I want to start by establishing how I would illustrate different levels of stylization. I encourage you to do the same exercise to see where you're at and what you struggle with most. Let's begin with a few sketches. When it comes to stylistic differences in the line art and sketching phase, it generally comes down to a difference in line quality, shapes, and exaggerated proportions. Also, this was more than just a portrait. The sketching phase is where I can establish composition and perspective for the painting. First, let's briefly talk about line quality. This is a topic that probably deserves its own study session, but for now, to make things as simple as I possibly can, I used heavier lines for focal points and the silhouette, and thinner lines for less important details and features. When trying to draw or paint realistically, we need to convince our audience that the subject could be placed into the real world without it feeling too out of place. I tried not to go deep with the sketch here, keeping the lines thin because it wouldn't be a primary aspect of the final painting. Some realistic painters would even forego this phase entirely, go straight into painting. I've tackled that technique with this painting here. Also, using references from real people that have features that resemble your character can be very useful here. I struggled to find perfect references for Sage, and by that I mean I didn't look too long, but I tried to go off my visual library and also mix specific parts of some references to get a general idea of what a real life Sage would look like. Next, I moved on to a semi-realistic style. There may be a difference in quality here compared to the other styles because this is typically what I would go for in my usual paintings. I tried to exaggerate aspects of Sage's design like her hair, eyes, and earrings without making it seem too unrealistic. Also, on a side note, I avoid putting too much detail outside of the focal points. This is generally a good rule of thumb for all paintings. It saves you a ton of time and points the viewer exactly where you want to look. Finally, out of my first 3 iterations of Sage was a departure straight into a very stylized sketch. There's a big reason why so many artists are in love with drawing extremely stylized characters. It allows you to go wild and emphasize features of your character without feeling too burdened by the laws of reality. Don't be afraid to make mistakes here. You can always go back and change things you're not happy with. Exploration of different ideas is integral to the stylization process. I think most artists would put a clean line art layer over their sketch, but I tend to find that takes a lot of personality out of the sketch and I end up not too happy with it. So I just cleaned up a few lines. And that's it. These were the final sketches. For rendering, since I'm trying to do multiple of these, I tried not to be too particular so I can learn more, and if you look too close you might start to see some messier parts of each painting. But with that aside, I thought it would be good to start with rendering the stylized sketch first. This will serve as a good framework for the lighting, shadows, and colors for the other 2. Here I went for a cel-shaded look, typically seen in animes, 2D animations, or games like Hades, Genshin Impact, or even Valorant itself. This style of rendering tries to stick to hard edges. In this style, it can be really easy to end up creating a piece that looks flat. If this is a problem you run into often, I'll look into how you paint shadow and light shapes. The lighting is integral to implying form. Also, the colors I used here are more saturated and vibrant than the colors I'll use in the other two styles. And as a quick note, I used a hard light layer with this kind of purple color to create the base shadows for all of these paintings. The semi-realistic style had a similar process to the stylized render. However, I started to introduce soft and lost edges to help signify form. In the previous piece, I wasn't too concerned about smaller details, but here I make sure to start introducing smaller shadows and variations in color where it makes sense. I left this sketch in here initially, but eventually I like to lasso out the facial features and delete the rest of the sketch. This can take away a bit of the muddiness that is caused by the sketch, while making sure you don't need to redraw any of the features you spent so long on. Rendering realistically is definitely a big challenge. You can see here that I fumbled around a lot, not knowing exactly where to start, what colors to use, where to place shadows, how certain features should look. When looking at realistic paintings or even photographs for reference, you might get a bit overwhelmed by the details like I did. But I told myself the first thing I should do is take a step back, focus on the bigger picture, introducing bigger shapes, and focusing on the main features first. Realism isn't about the details, but rather the accuracy of proportion, form, and lighting. There isn't too much of a difference in terms of process between this and the semi-realistic painting. I just made sure that Sage's features were as true to life as I could make them. You may have noticed that these renders seem to all follow similar steps, starting with a sketch, then base colors, then to big shadow shapes, before getting into more detailed lighting and rendering. Although I don't think this is the only right way to go about making an illustration, I think it's really important to have a good formula like this to rely on. Now, if I ever need to make a piece in a specific style, I would know the recipe, and I might just need to alter a few ingredients. Speaking of which, maybe we can take a look at some specific styles from some well-known IPs. First, let's do a quick look at Arcane, an artistic masterpiece in many ways, but I'm entirely interested in the characters for now. Maybe we can look at other aspects another day. Remember, we have a recipe now, so I got my sketch, placed my colors, and drew my base shadows. Besides bigger shadows around the eyes and under the chin and lips, these first steps aren't that different from any of my other pieces. Since most of the time in Arcane, the characters are 3D models, there isn't noticeable line art around the characters like there would be in some 2D animations. However, some lines are used to emphasize features like the eyes, nose, and around the chin. Because of the lack of lines, I painted over and deleted most of the sketch like I would in a realistic illustration, then drew in smaller lines where I felt they would be appropriate. I also made sure to have large, sharp, and clear shapes similar to the show. If you wanted to illustrate in a style similar to Arcane, I would focus on understanding their eyes. This feature stands out more than anything else, with bright highlights on the outskirts of the tear duct and usually dark shadows on the eyelids. Now, I don't really watch that much anime. I think I've only watched 3 in total, but every time I've seen clips of Cowboy Bebop, I was pretty impressed with the art. So I figured if I were to study any anime, it should be one of the old greats. Although as I got further and further into the illustration, I noticed that it's kinda hard to make it in a specific anime style. This is the first time in a very long time I tried to draw anything like this, but I feel like a lot of perceived art style actually comes from the designs and the outfits of the characters. Since I wanted to keep each painting similar and easily comparable, I didn't want to change Sage's outfit in any way to match the show. Instead, I just aimed for a general anime look, but I mostly only used Cowboy Bebop as reference. This illustration was pretty quick, just line art, colors, shadows, and a few highlights, and it was done. You could definitely go further adding reflected light, color variations, but I chose not to, keeping it as simple as possible. I felt it was only appropriate to study the work of TB Choi, since she was the inspiration for this video. Like I mentioned before, she seems to switch between rendering styles a lot, probably because she works on many different projects. But I watched a few of her videos and live streams over the last year, and I noticed she sketches in a very specific way, using minimal amounts of confident yet loose strokes. She would frequently place two almost parallel lines next to each other, which I assume is her way of utilizing searching lines. This also provided the illusion of movement in some areas, which made the sketches feel more alive. Because of how masterful TB Choi's sketching was, I mostly focused on getting this skill down. But in terms of rendering for this piece, I just did a bit of cel shading with a few soft edges where it felt appropriate. So with all of these studies out of the way, what did we learn? Some artists are obsessed with finding an art style, and I fully understand why. However, I feel that if you can learn the fundamentals of the creation process, you can illustrate in whatever way you wish. Now I know if I ever needed to adapt to a project I'm hired for, or maybe I just feel like drawing differently one day, I can refer back to my recipe, make small adjustments in shapes, line quality, edges, and a couple of other things, and I would be back on track. If you want to study someone in particular, I would try to draw similar subjects to who you're trying to study, and then compare the differences between your drawing and theirs. Try not to focus on how good or bad your illustration looks compared to theirs, but instead on bigger ideas like proportions, lines, and a few other aspects I mentioned in the video. There is one thing I have to come clean about. I said I drew Sage in 6 different styles, but there was one masterpiece I left out.